This is Duke University.
And now Kathy Rudy is going to introduce Donna Haraway.
Thank you. Again.
Okay.
Hi. So I recognize that it's not normal form to introduce someone at Duke with a fantasy, but I've never been a conformist, so here goes. My fantasy introduction to Donna Haraway begins with a music video worthy of VH1 of the best agility dogs in Durham, running through their routines on top of peaks and platforms, plowing through fabric tunnels, holding up or bursting through signs saying, "Welcome to Durham, Donna," and "We heart Haraway." This fantasy music video is set to the song "Human" by an indie band called The Killers. And the name of the band itself is significant in the fantasy as per Haraway's distinction between killing and making killable. For me, the song captures much of what it must be like for dogs to enter our world and to connect with us in the way that really only dogs can. To give you just a sense of the lyrics, and I have a stack of CDs available if you want a souvenir of the conference, come up and pick one up. I did my best to, this is a song that you should be hearing if I had pulled my act together. I did my best to notice when the call came down the line, up to the platform of surrender I was brought, but you were kind. And sometimes I get nervous when I see an open door, but I close my eyes, clear my heart, I cut the cord and ask, are we human or are we dancers? My signs are vital, my hands are cold, and I'm on my knees looking for answers. Are we human or are we dancers? In the final verse of the song, in my fantasy introduction, all these well-trained agility dogs from Durham seen in the video would march up to Haraway unaccompanied and lick her face intensely and immensely. The dogs then would be the ones welcoming her to Feminist Theory Workshop. If by chance you've never seen agility or other dog competitions like rally, flyball, or freestyle, let me simply say that these are finely tuned relationships between humans and dogs, where the dogs perform certain and varied tasks only when their partners, humans, have trained them well, practiced for hundreds of hours, given clear signals and communications, and offered virtually unconditional love and acceptance. No dog could perform well if she thought her partner's love depended on her performance. She has to believe in the connection in order to try to win. These events are magical interspecies performances worthy of the most extravagant science fiction musings. Like the song in my fantasy video suggests, they are really dances. Sadly, though, this introduction remains a fantasy for several reasons. First, although my dogs are often in classes, I don't yet do agility. Instead, in a ring way off to the side, my big hounds and pit bulls and I do obedience. In other words, we're still trying to build the kind of connections that might someday lead to agility. That means I'm not exactly part of the popular crowd. However, the dogs and women in those more admired rings were sympathetic to my fantasy and allowed me to do some filming. I had sent them links to Haraway discussing agility and dogs on YouTube, and every single one of them told me she gets it right. Indeed, they were completely impressed that someone inside the academy understood their world. But then it turns out there's a major agility trial in Greensboro today, and even a Donna Haraway speech couldn't trump such a competition. Besides that, when I described my intro a couple of months ago to one of my colleagues, who is here but will go unnamed, she confessed a little nervousness at having a bunch of dogs running around loose in the middle of FTW. She reminded me that not all feminists were as comfortable around other species as Haraway, and I keep forgetting. So I couldn't get them here, and perhaps shouldn't bring them here anyway, and without the dogs themselves, the video seemed like a rather vacant signifier. I struggled for many, many weeks, and I really did, with a standard intro, but couldn't fight the feeling that what I really wanted was for the dogs themselves to welcome Haraway to our world in Durham. Something told me that the lion's share of gratitude for her work really belongs to the dogs in a good sense. And here I must backtrack just a bit. Each year, my department has an annual theme that's unrelated to FTW. 1011 has been the question of species and the question of the animal, and we have had a glorious year here with two of Donna's former students, Chris Weller and Ava Hayward, as postdocs. Sharing this year with Chris and Ava has been utterly delightful. They have contributed so much to the Duke community, and I expect I will stay friends with them forever. We've also brought in Irene Pepperberg, who works with African Greys and language acquisition, Temple Grandin, a person with autism who designs humane slaughterhouses, and next week we'll hear a talk by Jane Goodall, all in to speak about animals and gender. We had a wonderful mini-conference last Thursday on New Voices in Animal Studies, in which HARAWAY responded to 5 fabulous papers. It's been an idyllic year for someone like me who is totally obsessed with animals. And I feel lucky to be in this department at a time when some aspects of feminist theory are breaking through to others' realities. Next year, however, our theme is the future of the long 1970s, feminism, by which we reckon, by our reckoning, started in the mid-1960s and ended somewhere in the mid-1980s. To prepare myself for 2 new classes next year, I've been pulling down long unused texts from that period and recently ran across Nell Morton's delicious monograph, The Journey is Home. Morton suggests in that text that the goal of feminist thinking is to hear each other into speech. She was speaking in the early 80s about human women bearing witness to each other's realities. But it occurred to me in rereading this book that that is exactly what HARAWAY has done for our dogs. In her Companion Species Manifesto, When Species Meet, and numerous other articles and videos, she has brought our dogs into conversation. Granted, dogs don't use sign language or lexicons like Koko, Washu, Kanzi, or other gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. But dogs do communicate, and HARAWAY has been a master at deciphering their affects and realities in a feminist register. She has taught all of us who live and work with dogs to listen differently and to recognize the glorious nature of their trials, tribulations, and worldviews. In HARAWAY's astute writings, canines are transformed into something almost like aliens with different and often superior intellects. Indeed, she calls her Aussie Cayenne a Klingon princess. Our dogs, in her rendering, learn how to fit into human culture and perform the tasks of comforting, exercising, and granting us humans equilibrium in our daily lives. It's like they were made for us and we for them. HARAWAY's work sidesteps the scientism of dog writers like Stanley Coren, Ray Coppinger, and even Duke's own Brian Hare. Equally, she maneuvers out of sentimentality of dog writers like John Katz, Tad Karasoti, or John Grogan. Her work is not about training, and here I could list 100 authors. It's about listening to them and teaching us humans to see our relationship with them as a form of feminist politics. In working alongside our dogs, she suggests that we emerge as rather different creatures who appreciate the joy of a very specific job well done, who identify with trauma, who are not afraid to run with joy as if no one else is watching. Quite simply, HARAWAY teaches us through her writing to be different kinds of human subjects, people who sense a slightly different reality, who are more in tune with sounds and smells, more aware of territory, more schooled in the dogged ways of companionship. At the risk of anthropomorphizing, and I know I've already done that today, but whatever, HARAWAY has almost single-handedly taught us, as Morton wrote a feminist, how to hear our dogs into speech. And as a result of her path-breaking thinking, our dogs and we have fuller and more vibrant lives. And so I close this with a very presumptuous proposal that kind of sums up my fantasy introduction. Almost 30 years ago, Donna, you wrote that you would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. And I totally appreciate how that sentiment circulated at that time. But humbly, I suggest to you that to my unruly pack of big hounds and pit bulls, to all the Durham dogs who couldn't be here because of agility trials, and to all the dogs out there whose guardians have been touched by your writing, you are and will remain nothing short of a goddess. Because of you, those of us who are on our knees looking for answers, Now think of ourselves as a little different than human. We are, like you, dancers.
Well, thanks, Kathy. That's really nice. It foregrounds my political slogan for this time, which is "Run fast, bite hard." You know, the title that I would like to work with today is "Staying with the Trouble, Becoming Worldly with Companion Species." And I would like to remind myself, as well as all of us, that companion species are not limited to, they are in a kind of a questioning relationship with this category of species, as we all are too, whoever comes into that peculiar category of we. They are kumpanas at table inside the materialities of Terran worldling, eating and being eaten unequally and non-optionally. And it is not a term for pet. It is not a term for cats and dogs and Gabon gray parrots. It includes, in various iffy ways, critters who inhabit those kinds of material semiotic positions. And note, I don't say subject positions, though I will use that terminology in very careful and specific ways to do very careful and specific or situated kinds of work. But I think of companion species as that unruly messmates at table situation, that unruly messmates at table in a deeply and relentlessly historical worlding that is not fundamentally about the emergence of conscious subjects or of desiring subjects, but in a science fiction sense is truly about worlding, worlds at stake, killing and making live, living and dying, flourishing and not, animate and not, lithic and bio. The worlding is at stake, and we are in some serious way responsible in it. Now, all of the talks that have gone before me are both profoundly instructive and internally disruptive of what I'm going to do. And I want to foreground some of those kinds of cat's cradling nodding that I feel like I inherit in the sense that Rosalind Morris perhaps suggested, and one of the senses suggested, in a kind of collective yet to come, a kind of democracy yet to come that isn't the agonism that is theorized by some, or the cooperation theorized by others, or the liberal or other forms, but something that is, in some deep way, not yet and necessary, and at least the subject of fantasy, and really the subject of much more than that. So if Anna Marie thinks she has problems with orgasms, try dogs. At least the ladies get to have, well, actually the ladies get both, which is sort of the problem. You know, a kind of disproportionate association, which of course always makes me at that moment be a woman in the strictest sense. You know, when faced with the notion that it's somehow less than it ought to be, give me that. I am truly a creature of the mud, not the sky, when faced with those particular kinds of sorting operations. But I do assure you that to be located in the domain of the organism is no more help than to be located in the domain of the orgasm, and no more specifiable as to its contents. But as I said yesterday, I'm constantly drawn by etymologies, you know, false and true. And by the time I've riffed them in myself long enough, I really don't want to know if they're false or true, lest I have to be disabused, you know, of the connections that have suddenly seemed true because they're so alluring. But I do think organism and orgasm are deeply tied to organ, organon, ergonomics, that there's a move from the great instauration of Bacon to the organisms of 19th century physiological economy, that there's a reason that the notions of division of labor and hierarchical organization of energy ricocheted across the English Channel between France and England in the 19th century, with a kind of borrowing of conceptual and material apparatuses from the calorimeter to the various other disciplinary tools that Foucault was so particularly alert at specifying for us, that the erg and the org move from these reorganizations of worldings that Bacon figured in terms of the idols and the essentially knowledge practices, to the fundamentally industrial capitalist practices that make it non-optional to be an organism. It is non-optional that I share a vast amount of my genome with my dog Cayenne, and that her saliva exchanges with me are only the beginning of the matter. It is non-optional that our layered molecular resonances and histories are figured in vast global databases that are valued, that are part of value maximization and exchanges and productions of variously interesting and enhancing and devastating forms of inequality. Okay? It's the non-optionality of being an organism and not the celebration of it. And it is also my deep experience, commitment, I testify, I confess, to the joy of it all. That I was struck by Fang Xiang's move to a certain kind of non-subject vitalism as a very tiny aleatory counter to an ultimate pessimism, a tiny crack that can become a giant gap. And that in the face of the established disorder and the world that is, alas, the case, all of these other realizations that we know, how is it possible to produce with each other and for each other the ongoingness of making a difference, of refusing the position of Chicken Little? The sky has not yet fallen, at least, even if a good part of our work is proclaiming that it's about to, if my indeterminacy is bigger than your indeterminacy. That it's about to, if only we produce the right argument, that will convince everyone that it has, and therefore they should clap for us before the end. If we can somehow get out of that kind of aggrandizing weirdness of a particular, to getting on with it, then we're somewhere that is where I would like this invocation called a we to be in our many kinds of styles and abilities to work. So that brings me then to the heredity inheritance play that Rosalind gave us with that remarkable layered reading of Gertrude Stein and of the question of waging war in the name of woman and women, and the inheritance of kinship theory and of structuralism, and the opening that inheritance plays excuse me, as a rhetorical apparatus vis-a-vis the fixity of heredity, and my wanting a black hole that sucks them both into something else that I'm calling feminist multi-species storytelling, or the production of a seriously non-Heideggerian open that gets it that he's poor in world in ways that I think a good dog could have told him otherwise. So recognition in anyone who's played around at all with the problem of human exceptionalism understands that recognition across species is proposed as one of the solaces, if not answers, to the problem of responsibility. And that the inclusionary strategy, not of right so much this time, but of the recognition that there's somebody, not something, in this contact zone of exchange by gaze or touch or some sensory modality, perhaps, excuse me, just by exchanging slime. But that recognition is proposed as a paradigm in countering human exceptionalism. And I have also been, I cannot not want that. I cannot not want that in deep ways. And one of my tasks, which I will try to illustrate with the materials of today's talk, is to take up some of the most contaminated concepts. Yeah, good idea. Plastic-infused water. Whatever, it'll be recycled, if not me. When you're a literalist, you have to live with it. And I am seriously a literalist. So, okay. I'm regularly taking up conceptual apparatuses and material apparatuses out of the last couple of hundred years of intellectual and political and economic practices, like labor, like play, like recognition, like rights, like flourishing, etc. And pushing and inhabiting them because of the sense I know how to get rid of them. I don't know how to do without them. And I'm a both-and kind of girl. So what I try to do is confront mutually incompatible truthiness. Mutually incompatible truthinesses for which I will live and die and see then what happens, because I feel like we are at stake. And recognition is one of those hard places. So the place I'm taking us today is actually to the Creatures of Empire world of Virginia Anderson, who took up the question of creatures of empire on the east coast of what became the United States, Massachusetts Bay Colony and Virginia and the Piedmont and the Chesapeake Bay area, and paid serious attention to what happens in relationships to the ways the pigs forage in the forest compared to the way they might have been part of a farming operation in England, and pays serious attention to the kinds of reorderings of whole ways of living and dying, whole natural social ecologies that turn on not some kind of subject intentional activity of yon pig without denying intentional subjective activity of yon pig, which has just as much right to it as we do, as Derrida. Never mind, that's a whole other riff. You know? The arrogance of ascribing it to yourself when you ask if so-and-so can do it, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so Virginia Anderson ran the Creatures of Empire story fundamentally in terms of an Atlantic world. And I take it up as a Northern Rockies girl, Northern Rockies in Colorado. I take it up in terms of the xenobiological ranching as capital accumulation and extractive practices in what became the United States. And the Spanish rough sheep, the Navajo churro sheep, are very good, not companions to think with, but non-optional companions at multiple levels of inheritance, as well as the more ordinary kinds of heredity. So let me start with a series of short quotes. First of all, there's the famous Spectres of Marx quote by Jacques Derrida. Inheritance is never a given, it is always a task. It remains before us. Then there's the anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose and the postdoctoral student in anthropology and environmental studies, Tom Van Doorn, putting together a book called Unloved Others, which is looking at the questions of life and death beyond the charismatic macrofauna or microfauna for that matter, and asking who's at stake within them. And Deborah Bird Rose, whose initial fieldwork was with the Yarrowland in the Northern Territory, and who wrote a beautiful book called Dingo Makes Us Human, and has subsequently looked at the white settler colony, camp draft and rodeo in the Northern Territory, and is really, really interested in the question of recuperation in former white settler colony worlds and their ranching economies, including their racialities and specialities. Okay. Deborah Bird Rose says, "What, though, is the fate of those threatened others that are unregarded, unliked, or even actively vilified?" And she goes on, "What does it mean to write in a time of exterminations and extinctions?" Then an artist I love named Patricia Piccinini, I'll show you a figure in a minute, says she pays particular attention to scientific and technological apparatuses in her art. She says, "I am particularly fascinated by the unexpected consequences of the stuff we don't want but must somehow accommodate. There is no question as to whether there will be undesired outcomes. My interest is in whether we will be able to love them." There's an ethical challenge, political challenge. Anna Tsing, who, among other things, tracks the commodity chains of Matsutake mushroom worlds, and in its really amazing global, multi-species, very interesting creations and accumulations of value, tracking the Vietnam and Iraq war veterans, collecting matsutake mushrooms in the Pacific Northwest with Hmong immigrants in the same mushroom collecting zones, and the marketers, the middle people marketers out of San Francisco and Seattle, so forth, tracking in this fabulously interesting collaborative practice to do an account of capital, contemporary capitalism. It's way bigger than capitalism. Tracking living and dying multi-species worlds with a non-negotiable commitment to multi-species storytelling, and with a non-negotiable commitment to the notion, as she says, human nature is a multi-species relationship. It's not like adding other species in, thank you. There is no condition of being on this planet that isn't always already a multi-species co-cobbling. Without a sentimental romanticism about that, though I keep a place for that in my, I confessed I keep a place for that. Okay. My colleagues in science studies, Anna Marie Moll and Mara Miel and John Law, say, like animals, we too are embedded in and enacted by practices. They are, by the way, at this moment writing about the slaughter of sheep in England in the hoof and mouth disease epidemic and the multiple state-enforced exterminations that go along with public health operations in the agriculture sector. They say, like animals, we too are embedded in and enacted by practices. To give up dreams of mastery is not to give up politics. Rather, it is to change their character. If animals are enacted in practices, then their character is not given in the order of things. Albeit with difficulty, our human-animal practice might be ordered differently, but they aren't. Okay? It implies a politics of situated and respectful interference. Situated and respectful interference. Non-innocent. Accepting the killing and making live as well as the living and dying. It's not enough to add death to life without paying attention to making live and making die, as well as the slow death and slow life that were exposed to us in Neil Ahua's paper, and the other papers of Thursday. So with that, as a kind of opening, my own work these days asks what it could possibly mean to inherit the histories of companion species on a blasted Earth where getting on together is still the task. Companion species break bread at table, and that is breaking bodies. It's in the word itself, kumpanes, with bread. Who is on the menu and at table is a question of ethical, political, economic, and ecological urgency. It's also not a new question, even in the future tense. Companions have somehow to get on together in that scary Australian English idiom. Moved by Deborah Rose, I want to ask what it might mean for human-animal studies in the zooethnographic mode. Okay. Never mind. There's a whole set of practices that I think we can start inventing that really take seriously what graphy would look like if it's without throwing away the many moves in ethnography that have, well, you get it. Okay. In the zooethnographic mode, to face those who come before, or to back those who come before, perhaps, so as to leave quieter, less wild country to those who come after. In other words, what might it mean for multi-species get? Okay. To inherit the past thickly in the present so as to age the future. I read Derrida's words, inheritance is never a given, it's always a task. It remains before us, through the lens of David Snyder's queries about kinship, Maria Puig's call for matters of care in an experimental life, and Deborah Rose's understanding from our Australian Aboriginal teachers of facing those human and not human who came before, unlike, on the whole, Euro-derived peoples or Euro-shaped peoples who have this remarkably silly tendency to face the future, as opposed to face those who came before so as to leave to those who come after, whom we most certainly do not see, something less terrible, to live thickly in a present that isn't a vanishing pivot point between past and future, but something thick and requiring the practices of care that her teachers called taking care of country when translated into an Anglophone idiom. And what does it mean to translate it then into a room like this? So Staying with the Trouble aims to work through two, though I'll only have time for one, ontological, ethical, and ecological cat's cradle knots of companion species. One, the people and the critters of the Navajo Sheep Project and other churro sheep humans and animals in the project of recuperation, not restoration, not reconciliation, not solution, but some kind of recuperation which is ongoing and real. And while there's never as much as there should be, there's a whole lot more than we thought going on that deserves the affirmation of recuperation. So that I suppose part of my way of addressing the seduction of pessimism for me is to get at that there's way more going on than I knew how to see until I started risking curiosity about that which is not in despair, about that which takes the risk to actually try to make a difference in the living and dying of intra-action and intra-patience, of those co-cobblings of action and passion in worlding, in that kind of science fiction, speculative fabulation worlding of multi-species storytelling that I am seriously committed to. Okay, so the second world I would tell you about but won't, and there's a rhetorical name for that kind of figure of speech of calling attention to something by not doing it. Nonetheless, I tried to look up that on Google this morning, but I couldn't find the name, but I'm in the... Exactly. I'll write it down after the talk. Anyway, it's the rapidly growing world of 21st century urban and peri-urban animal agriculture, and particularly doing it with chickens. I will tell you later, there's probably a word for that figure of speech too, that in the year 2000 there were about 2 million chickens in Habarana, Botswana, and about 250,000 people. And that the megalopolises of this world, for the cities yet to come of Abdul Malik Simon, are multi-species in ways that those who think the rural-urban distinction in its modernist phantasmagoric modes don't have a clue about. All you have to do is look at Cairo and see the chicken lofts and pigeon lofts across the roof of 2011 Cairo and get it that the human exclusivist story that's being told on the streets is not the beginning of what's going to constitute food security in the megalopolises of this planet. That a planetarity through the megalopolises forces an attention to multi-species agricultures, plants, animals, and microbial, thinking of the collaborations of bees and people and microbes and honey and a lot of other that good stuff. But this question of the city yet to come, Simon's term, requires a kind of utter refusal of the notion that paying attention to, say, chickens in the city is the preserve of upper middle class, overly educated, seriously over-leisured people building chicken palaces. When, in my view, we're looking at the name of the game of living and dying on Earth in some really major ways. And I will have something to say about urban animal agriculture if I get there. But all of this is a practice of cat's cradle, which takes me to my next figure. Okay. Lila Goldenthal's amazing painting of cat's cradle. Cat's cradling, or string figure games, as you probably know, is a worldwide game that became of interest to late 19th and early 20th century Anglophone ethnologists, kind of right before the period of Reichert's Spider Woman, or it's very much in the collecting and taxonomizing of cultural difference. So you get these collections of string figures worldwide among the ethnologists, or late 19th, early 20th century ethnologists, and their classification, which is one interesting way to track these patterns. And you're looking at a kind of interesting historical moment in comparative ethnography going on there. But what we've also got going on in Cat's Cradle is a set of relaying actions, a set of practices of knotting and entangling that exists at the literal level and at the figural level at the same time, such that, as Isabel Stenger's called my attention to, For a pattern to take place, coyotes running in opposite directions, is an important Navajo pattern. String figure games are an important Navajo winter activity and is used now in reacculturating Navajo youngsters in Los Angeles or Phoenix or whatever in Navajo storytelling practices. It's seasonal, it's storied, it's recuperative, it's inherited, it's a child game, an adult game, taught, among other things, to teach patience. String figures come rather late to Western Europe, but they're taken up passionately in such a way that I actually thought it was sort of an old indigenous European tradition, but it's not. It probably comes in from Asia in terms of its travels to Europe. But it arises independently in various places. But what it takes to play cat's cradle is the capacity of action and passion, relaying, holding still and receiving, making and undoing, dropping strings and undoing. The dropped string can destroy a world. The patterning is in play. And I think of that as the practice of feminist theory and the practice of scholarship more broadly. I think of us as cat's cradling, including the risk of dropping the pattern. Okay? That undoing, that is the risk of pattern making. So Patricia Piccinini, Can We Love the Unloved, does this installation in relation to Camus' The Stranger. And she calls this the long-awaited. Okay? It's an apparently friendly-looking sort of mirror Shar-Pei with a human face. You know, the wrinkled skin of the Shar-Pei, I don't know. You maybe saw in the Science News recently the same gene for all the wrinkling of the Shar-Pei dog is also a gene that causes periodic fever and inflammation. Never mind, you didn't see that. Okay, anyhow. The long-awaited, we have what looks like a cute alien who might turn out to be not so cute at all, the apparently safe child who might not turn out to be so safe at all, and the question of there will be mistakes. No question, can we love them? Perhaps too easily. And then this dog, Dogon Grit, is a relative of mine. This dog, Dogon Grit, is an Australian Shepherd in the same lineage as my working dog agility partner, Cayenne, who is widely known as an international scholar, and has University of California papers as my research assistant, which is the only way she has permission to be on campus. She's actually a research dog. Now, what they mean by that and what we mean by it are, two very different things. In any case, point being, this is my relative. We are in a kinship group of a non-optional kind on many levels, including the non-optional inheriting of history. So when I ask, whom and what do we touch when we touch each other? I'm not kidding. I inherit the xenobiological process of turning the Rocky Mountain West into ranch country. I inherit the herding trial. I inherit the stock dog world. I inherit the breeding world of both sheep and dogs. I inherit the history of fibers and wool, the history of the textile industry. I inherit the moves from cotton to wool in the markets and the labor practices, exported, migrant, and not. There is no way when we exchange saliva and little darter tongue kisses in our more intimate moments that might be called orgasm. I don't know. You wouldn't do that. I might. More females get to have them. Why just the ladies? In any case, I don't really do that. You can't imagine the people who take this literally. Or is that just another figure of speech that actually affirms what I'm denying? So what I am trying to say is that it's not just the agility field or the so-called nonviolent, low interference training methods, which I assure you are a disciplinization of obedience, which I mainly do badly. For one thing, we took our dogs to obedience class wearing question authority buttons. So really a setup. It's a serious setup for causing your dog a lot of trouble. It is truly non-optional. Whom we touch when we touch each other is to somehow be accountable to the not the whole history, and as if you can somehow be accountable to everything. But I can't not know the conditions of our being on this planet. Okay? I can't not know that we are both but differently white. I can't not know our species and labor and class assignments as we take up a practice of middle-aged women running on agility courses, okay? As we take up a sport practice. So that's what I mean when I talk about cats cradling or companion species. So let's go to the Navajo churro sheep world. And I take us to the four corners, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, to Diné-Bikéyah, the Navajo reservation, with the Hopi reservation situated right smack in the center, which has set up the Navajo-Hopi problems on Big Mountain or Black Mesa, that the Peabody coal mine is probably the biggest player on Big Mountain, Black Mesa, including the control of the water aquifer, just as in Israel-Palestine, whoever controls the water is in major control of worlding. I am in the midst of a colonially occupied and possessed territory that is also very much the site of contemporary, fraught, non-innocent sovereignty, immigrant, democratic, et cetera, very much the place of cobbled together kinds of cat's cradling alliances for the kind of recuperation I will describe. What I need to do to get us into this place is read for you from Ezekiel. This is a bone collection. There are two double deaths that I will narrate. The first one is the first Huildi, or the first long walk, the forced relocation of the Navajo to Bosque Redondo by the U.S. Army in 1863, and the incarceration in concentration camp for 5 years before the Navajo Treaty of 1868, and the carving out of, at that point, a small reservation. The Navajo, in contrast to most reservations, actually have seen their land, saw their land holdings grow until the 1930s, when that was stopped in some interesting ways. But the first double death, that killing of ongoingness that Deborah Bird Rose gives us, she talks about the killing of possibility, the killing of generations, is double death. The first double death is the relocation of the Navajo, who had become a pastoral economy, trading very much, certainly much involved already in commodity exchange by the mid-19th century. Very much both subsistence and market commodity people rooted in sheep and horses, and to some extent, but a rather small extent compared to the Apache, cattle. And who had acquired their sheep, who are the creatures of empire, who are, among other things, tools of pacification in the Spanish mission complex. Very much tools of the collection and pacification, so-called, of the resident peoples of the West and the Southwest. Sheep were players in the production of settled mission pastoralism. Okay. The Navajo took their sheep both by trade and raid, and therefore regarded as mainly criminals, and are relocated in a military operation where the sheep orchards are cut down, their agricultural areas are destroyed. The people are related, the sheep are exterminated, basically. And then they are resettled in 1868 with sheep who then increase. We then enter an economic period in the latter part of the 19th century through to the New Deal, shall we say. We're collapsing a lot here. Latter part of the 19th century to the New Deal, where the Navajo increased their flocks tremendously, to the point that, from the point of view of Anglo-agricultural experts, the erosion of the land was becoming irreversible, and the serious species destruction of edible grasses and the rest in the face of massive overstocking is very much part of the picture of the first decades of the 20th century on Diné-Bikéyah, or the Navajo, what became Navajo Nation. Okay? So from the Navajo point of view, however, one of the things that's going on is the price of wool. So that while there's an increase of Navajo population by about 15% over this period, and an increase in the herds of about 800%, the price of wool is maintained so low, and the valuation of wool is done through weaving, through the rugs. This is Kathy McCloskey's story in Swept Under the Rug. So that a Navajo woman weaver, this is a matrifocal and matrilocal culture for the most part, where the women, for the most part, men and women both own sheep. Little girls and little boys own sheep. Flocks are accreted out of individually owned sheep. But the sheep are mainly associated with the grazing areas of the mothers of the. It's fundamentally matrifocal, matricentric in these particular ways that have everything to do with sheep. Okay? Navajo women supported their families through this period by marketing their blankets by weight to the trading posts. So the Navajo blankets that now sell for, let's say, $250,000 at a Sotheby auction, okay, were sold by weight okay, to the trading posts, resulting in approximately, for a constantly controlled dollars, 2 cents an hour to the Navajo weaver. It's about $1.30 now, in case you're worrying about progress. I mean, never mind, we'll go there in a minute. But what I want to point out is that the overstocking and the erosion is in part because of the extraordinary non-optional pressures to increase flocks, to get a less and less marginal return out of wool in an unstable wool market. And the role of the trade mercantile capital plays a very big role in this question. Come the New Deal and erosion control, okay, the second double death occurs. Okay? And that's this picture. This picture is shot in the 1970s of a mass murder of goats and sheep that took place in 1934. The Navajo were forced by armed mobile agents of agricultural authorities, including tribal authorities, working in a dependent colonial or post-colonial relation with U.S. agents. They were mandated to reduce flocks by 30%, and they preferentially shot the so-called rough sheep. That is to say, the Spanish, dirty, brown, racially no good, rough sheep, not improved, not Rambouillet, not Merino, not soft wool, the rough wool sheep, who were, of course, the carpet wool sheep of the Navajo. Okay? So that almost all of the Navajo Churro sheep were exterminated across the 1930s in what produced an economic collapse of the Navajo economy, which in some significant way they've never recovered from, although as you saw before, they weren't already rich. But the secondary payment, the welfare payment, wage and military, and then uranium and coal mining income streams, trickles, drips, you know, flows, I don't know, pick your liquid word, well, you know, in the face of the collapse of the sheep economy, the face of the double death of the sheep economy. So that this boneyard, these are bones that were still narrated in the 1970s when this picture was shot. People knew which sheep and goats were in that pile, whose lambs were whose. The narration of these sheep, which, mind you, were sold, eaten, shorn, lived with, worked with, part of living and dying with, making live and making die with. These sheep were not some kind of romantic outside of all commodity world sheep. Okay, this is a world that does not resolve into various kinds of heritage industry innocence. Okay, which is why they are good to stay with the trouble with, not just good to think with. Okay, so Ezekiel says, the hand of the Lord came upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me down in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me all around them. There were very many lying in the valley, and they were very dry. He said to me, mortal, can these bones live? That is on the website for the Navajo Churro Sheep Project, which is how I found it. I don't read Ezekiel regularly. Not that I shouldn't, I just don't. Okay. Now, Navajo Churro sheep boys look like this. They have got these really gorgeous double horns. One of the ways in which Navajo Churro sheep flocks were reassembled, beginning in the 1970s, was because the remnant sheep had been collected by a guy named Buster Gonzalez in Hollywood, who ran a little shoot-'em-in-a-barrel out of LA safari business to shoot and collect Navajo Churro heads. I shouldn't even be, there's nothing particularly funny about that story, but there's something deeply what physical, ironic, necessary about that story? The part of the remnant flock is maintained by Hollywood leisure hunters in the shoot-in-the-barrel mode. Navajo ewes look like this. This is a multicolored crowd. The churro sheep are rough sheep, which were not the high-value merino sheep that also came out of Spain, which I'm sure you know, but are the sheep who can survive in very dry conditions. The churro sheep ewes are very competent dry land mothers. Their lambs are very competent. They can handle quite a range of rough forage. And like all sheep, seems to be a species trait, they recognize and interact with an interesting and kind of ongoing make society together basis. Something like 50 to 100 different individuals whom they know by face and remember across the years, so that flock formation is maintained by various kinds of sociality, such that the sheep, if they're broken up, if the sheep are handled in such a way that disrupts these socialities, they really do become different animals. It's not like there's some sort of sheepiness that's there underneath the layers of culture or something. The sheep are historical beings every bit as much as we are, who are and are not what they are out of the worlding in which they actually do, okay? Usually in unchosen circumstances, okay? So that the Navajo churro sheep are particularly well adapted to the transplantation from the dry areas of Spain and through the Spanish mission complex into the Four Corners area, unlike the greasy, the lanolin wool sheep of the Rambouillet and Merino breeds. This is, of course, the highly romantic Curtis photography that we're all familiar with that gives the Navajo flocks as a kind of pastoral, romantic pastoral. This similarly out of that same kind of romantic pastoral tradition of photography, which is also the photography of a labor process, but rarely narrated that way, of Navajo women shearing sheep. Again, narrated in terms of the romanticism of Navajo weaving, but not narrated in terms of the price of wool, and that rug is going to be sold by weight at the trading post. Up to the 1960s, they were sold by weight, in case we think that stopped early. And then this is the only picture of dogs I'm actually going to show. This is the Life magazine photograph of a Navajo girl with her dogs. These are guardian dogs, not guard dogs. They're of great mixed genetic stock, kind of any dog who's sort of willing to do this, who basically is an alert and boundary guardian dog, not a guard dog. Okay? The Navajo dogs are lived with as guardian dogs until the more modern period, with the collapse of the sheep economy, has produced vast numbers of feral and sterilized and miserable dogs on the reservation and in reservation towns, and then they become the subject of various sterilization and rescue discourses, which I actually donate money to. Again, a kind of non-optional cot in it. So, Navajo Sheep Project, 1970s, guy who teaches at San Luis Obispo, Cal State campus, falls in love with Navajo churro wool at a wolf fair, starts finding out about the sheep, starts collecting them. He and his students starts interviewing elders in the various regions in and around Diné-Bikéyah, starts interviewing the Hispano families in the sheep industry in New Mexico and Arizona, starts building up a seed stock flock. He and his students then hook up with the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy, Rare Breeds Conservancy, hook up with the semen collection and genome banking worlds of Fort Collins, in the kind of frozen genomics world of Fort Collins. Hook up with the women in resistance on Big Mountain, Black Mesa, for providing them with Navajo churro sheep for weaving as part of their resistance to relocation into Peabody coal mining. Hook up with llama breeders. That's why I show you this really low resolution, not low reservation photo. The Great Pyrenees, you know, the Basque origin guardian dogs were originally used in this recuperation of the Navajo churro sheep, but it turned out llamas were much better at the job, migrant labor of an interesting kind. Trained llamas are supplied to Navajo sheep people. Mind you, about 35% of contemporary Navajo keep sheep, and it's still an important part of income for a lot of people. but it is no longer, and probably never will be again, at least not in the near future, any kind of major economic survival strategy, but it is a recuperation strategy. Okay? Part of this story is also taking up a reestablishment of a series of connections of travel on the land. People in this room surely know that raising sheep is connected, sheep and goats and the rest, connected with these vast planet-making transhuman practices. These tracks etched in the flesh of the earth, where the sheep have walked from seasonal pasturages in between pasturages and markets. The etching on the skin of the earth of these pathways of travel of people and their animals, the animals and their people. One of the processes of sedentarization, which creates, among other things, ecological destruction, is the interrupting of the travel between winter and summer pastures, right? So part of the recuperation project with Navajo Churro sheep was the reestablishing of the presence of the sheep in a pasture in Colorado on what was called, Sacred Peak of the North in English, but in Navajo as Didenitsa, which I don't pronounce correctly, it's among the things tonal. But of course the sheep had to be trucked there. And it was part of a grant funded by the Sustainable Agriculture Research Foundation, which is a branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the university, Colorado State University in Fort Collins, is part of the scholarly apparatus that represences the sheep in this pasture, among other things, to restore a grasslands ecology in the face of the takeover of the scrub oak forest. Okay? So that these practices of recuperation are, among other things, petroleum dependent in the form of trucks. Okay? The apparatus of recuperation and of rebuilding the connections of weaving, marketing, pasturing, living and dying with. There's a kosher jerky marketing operation out of this. There's a sheep dairying operation out of this. There is very much Black Mesa Weavers for Life and Land. Well, actually, there's a zoo, but I'm not going to talk about that. There's part of the winter pasture. The Dina Navajo Lifeway is a Navajo Sheep Breeders Association organization that supports sheep, goat, and mohair producers, okay, in a full spectrum way around the Sheep is Life translation, an Anglophone translation, of a particular set of commitments built into the Blessing Way and built into Navajo notions of huswa or what gets called beauty. The Sheep is Life Festival every year brings together a multi-state, multi-ethnic, multi-racial group to learn the crafts of living and dying with sheep, Navajo Churro sheep in particular, and becomes a scene of Navajo language workshops for Navajo kids, becomes a scene where some of the Navajo kids in weaving workshops reteach some of their parents' patterns and vice versa. Some very interesting generational exchanges going on, building up of curricular units for high schools, whole lot of things. Black Mesa Weavers for Life and Land is a cultural survival, that's the organization in Massachusetts, co-founded by DNA activists and a Newton, Massachusetts activists to band together for both resistance to the coal mining on Black Mesa and to produce Navajo rugs at a price that is livable and to foreground the qualities and beauties of the Navajo Churro sheep. They're a fair trade organization which in and of itself hides the swept under the rug fact that most Navajo pattern blankets are woven in the globalized knockoff trade and are imported from Mexico and even Thailand, and that Zapotec weavers are assigned Navajo patterns, non-optionally, okay? And they undersell the genuine Navajo rug by quite a lot, so that, say, a hotel is renewing itself in Santa Fe, they might buy authentic, quote-unquote, Navajo rugs for the walls and the knockoffs for the floor. Unless there is an organization, the fair trade in and of itself is not enough. There's the sustainable lifeways issue that is both in place and out of place, both rooted and routed, both traveling and dwelling, but not in some kind of abstract way. Which traveling and which dwelling, for whom? Okay? Which weaving, for whom, and how. Okay? Black Mesa Weavers for Life and Land are seriously savvy about this. They were also seriously savvy about their board of directors, as was Dina Beina, being numerically dominated by women, and then also by Navajo, but not only by Navajo women, in the face of the very problematic patriarchal practices of the Navajo Tribal Council, which is a much contested matter in Navajo nationhood and sovereignty. But these organizations involved in recuperation have taken some very interesting stands on gender in all of this. Name of the directors, this is Esther Newton, the Massachusetts woman with one of the ewes she's particularly closely bonded with. This is a scene of the wool buy. The price, basically one of the things that happens is that the relatively more wealthy buyers in Massachusetts buy the wool and resell at high prices and put on various kinds of price pressures. Question of generations, continuities across generations. And then I pulled this off the internet because the trading post scene remains part of my story. This is a two Gray Hills blanket attributed by name to a very famous weaver, Betty Charlie, on sale for $6,800, which is the high price range, online from a trading post that has itself become committed to a kind of fair trade, fair pricing practice that gets back up to about 80% of a price to the weaver. But it's put together by a man who made his fortune in the art market, in the old Navajo textiles that sold through the art auction world. Okay? So that there is this troubling but important staying with the trouble relay and alliances that don't resolve into, well, if I just think Navajo, then I'm safe. Or if I just think cultural survival, then I'm safe. We all know better than that. But when we get at the details, it gets really interesting, I think is a good part of my point. Okay. The story I'm not going to tell is the urban agriculture story. And both Cuba's a big player, Shanghai's a big player, many cities in Africa are big players, Madison, Wisconsin, Detroit, Missoula, Montana, all big players. The big players in foregrounding animal urban agriculture and questions of food and justice across species are part of my picture. Alice Avorka, remember that feminist political economy and cultural geography, remember that the term zoopolis is Jennifer Walsh's out of Los Angeles. And then in many ways, the invention of a particular kind of natural cultural geography, a kind of geography that's attuned to multi-species materialities, is straight up a feminist political economy, scholarly invention, which is erased in the canon and citation practices among us. Alice Avorka is one of the descendants of that, and she's the one who's feeding me what I know about the Habarona, Botswana chicken industry scene. And it's her people who gave permission to use their pictures by name. In their note, intensive agriculture chicken scene. 80% of Botswana chickens are in an intensive raising conditions. How long will the practices, if I love to watch them grow, be maintainable in a vertically integrated industry, which nonetheless is not for export, at least not yet. Botswana is an interesting place to look at this. This is my American Gothic picture. This is my civic space politics picture. This is Missoula, Montana, the skateboard and the hen. This is how most chickens in the United States and indeed worldwide live. This is a scene near me in Santa Cruz of an effort to produce pasture-raised critters in the labor practices, the markets, the species, the rest of it, which closed down a couple of months ago in no small part because it costs too much in agribusiness-dominated California to lease land for this practice. You cannot do this without paying attention to the materialities of it, including the racialized labor systems, the cobbling together and repurposing the gleaning of technology out of abandoned Central Valley equipment, the building them farrowing apartments for parturition, for farrowing, but the pigs actually decided to have their babies under the oak trees. They're fed surplus organic produce dumped by organic farmers for the pigs. Very fine. Food and justice activities. I end then with another kind of figure that is not only a figure. All of my figures are actual practices. Okay? I end with an art project by Beatrice da Costa, who is at UC Irvine, engineer, artist, attuned to urban critters, and strikes up an alliance with the racing pigeon fanciers of Los Angeles and Irvine, with the engineers who were doing miniaturization and surveillance packages, various ways of getting micro-monitoring packages, with the urban activists in air pollution areas, with other art activists, and cobbles together a collaboration among the racing pigeons, their people, and the rest to do real-time monitoring of 300 feet above ground, which is a very hard to monitor area, in areas that are not monitored by the official stations of California air pollution monitoring, and to stream it via GPS real-time streaming online so that the actual real-time air pollution levels of various neighbors will be relayed back by the working pigeons. And she was attacked by PETA. Okay. She's attacked for a kind of art use of animals PETA is not happy with, but is reconciled to, in the sense they can't challenge it legally, the scientific use of pigeons, but thought they could get at the soft underbelly of the art use. So the notion of co-workers was not allowable within that particular notion of rights. Now, many rights people are much more savvy than that, and I too will argue for rights in situated ways, including rights for animals, partly because of the lack of another vocabulary for certain kinds of situated struggles. Okay? But what I want to foreground and end with is this picture of co-working, co-playing, co-inventing, or in my words, a picture of an open. It's not fixed by function. Something new is happening on the planet that wasn't here before. It's a practice of curiosity and risk. It is worlding, and it does not, its Dasein does not depend on that kind of relentless, utter boredom that scholars have learned to mimic in Heidegger. Enough.
We have about 20, 25 minutes for Q&A.
Cool. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Really, really great. You talked a lot about living and dying together, and kind of co-living and co-playing. And I would really love to hear you comment on, I guess, an observation that it seems to me with the sheep and certainly with other animals, that some animals are doing more dying than living.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And,
Oh, yeah.
And it seems in your theoretical work that you seem to make almost a cognizant decision not to provide us with too many tools to engage with or critique that. And I guess I would like to hear you comment. A general sort of ask you to comment on decision making.
Well, there are several issues involved in that. One of them is I still have questions about these ways of life, and I've actually made up my mind about the animal industrial practices. I think they should be brought to a screeching halt in ways that does as least damage as possible to the people and organisms and technologies and lands involved. And on your Northern Colorado ranchers, what would it actually take to restore the ability to raise, to go through the entire life cycle in place? What would it actually take to disrupt the world created by the railroad tracks and the barbed wire scenes, such that agroecological ranching can be part of a multi-species Northern Colorado grasslands reworlding? I'll work for that. And I will remain in touch with my ongoing questions about raising in order to die, raising in order to consume, the questions of killing. I will keep asking my questions of whether or not that's killing without making killable. Is it actually possible, not for all the time everywhere, but for us to do that without a level of hypocrisy that sails through the ceiling? And so part of it for me is that I am truly staying with my trouble I actually have real questions about all of this. And I have the illusion of knowing too many of the answers, okay, about the intensive agricultural scene. Not too many of the answers in terms of what do I think about the Thai chicken industry and what's going on really with the labor forces in North Carolina in pork and chicken industries. It's not, I mean, the room for inquiry and struggle and collaboration is just immense. But there is a way in which I'm still trying to know whether this recuperative practice is my effort to obtain solace before I go to sleep, or whether this is a real world, this is a worlding practice that truly deserves our best.
Now, I guess maybe following from that, I love the notion of not making it livable, and I sort of
We all like that.
Right, I know. And I have a sense that for you, storytelling is one way not to make it livable.
Or to cover up. Storytelling is, I don't have any particular choice about doing storytelling. I think it's hardwired. Storytelling is a really, really important material semiotic practice. It could hardly be dealt with as purely psychical or something. Storytelling worlds, including at the level, a science says example. Group of research subjects, paid college kids, whatever, are given a story about a disease outbreak. And one story is peppered with beast imagery, and the other is peppered with infection imagery. What do they recommend in order to, actually it was a crime example, not an infection. There's crime. One is given beast metaphors and the other is given infection metaphors, and then they're asked how they will handle the crime outbreak in the place. And it's controlled for ideology, it's controlled for politics, it's controlled for age, race, sex, blah, blah. A single mention of one of those metaphors and exclusion of the other will reliably predict whether they go for police force solutions or various forms of, which is hardly free of the police, various forms of health organization solutions. But the relative degree of punitive solution depended on an unconscious, I mean, most of them couldn't tell you about the metaphors. The metaphors were a material force in what actually happened in the world. I think storytelling's like that.
I noticed in your figure of recuperation a sort of ethical call, but a part of me was wondering, because in some ways recuperating is caring for some type of a victim of a negative force, like animals that may go extinct, systems that may end. And I think there are some systems that can't be recuperated, and it seems like you're still calling for the recuperation anyway.
Like what?
It seems that despite your call for recuperation, not all of these systems will be able to survive.
Nor should they.
And so, are you still calling for their care as you watch them die? That was the sense that I got, like a responsibility for being aware of that loss.
Look, it's a bit like this. There's no general answer to that question, first of all. I think the question of to what is who accountable is a question that can't be answered normative by a series of listing of norms or something. It can't be answered philosophically by having an ethical rule book. Or the reason I showed the Dogon Grit winning high-end trial slide was to inhabit that question. There are all sorts of entanglements that were crucial to being in this room at this time together. The ones I foregrounded had to do with being accountable for white settler colony agriculture. Now that's to some degree a choice, and trying to sort out, and not just white settler colony, but the array of issues around that. Part of it comes from finding, and you're always in love with an inappropriate being. That's sort of part of the definition of being in love. You always wake up and discover that it's the wrong object, and too bad it's too late. You know, it's the definition of love, as far as I'm concerned. Well, I feel a little bit that way about the sheep, you know. or the grasslands. I think that we find ourselves to care. And we can give various accounts of how that happened. But at the end of the day, this materiality of being in the cat's cradle game here and not there, and then what is to be done, that old revolutionary question, what is to be done, is out of that. It's not taking an overview and saying, oh, that's important, and 10 of you should work there, and 3 of you should work there, and then we'll have a movement over there, and the proletariat's over here. You know? It just didn't work like that, which is why I use the figure of cat's cradling, and that kind of relaying and nodding and connecting and taking the risk of asking who we are. Who's the we? And that then becomes, that's very close to the core definition of my open. Who's the we? Because that is about saying which worlds will endure and which won't. And there are some worlds that I will actively go about killing. If I can. I don't have enough power. You know. You see what I mean?
Yeah. For that, there's a lot in there for me to absorb. I have a question that is a real question, and not something to take as for any question. And it's about the status of the indigenous people or Native Americans in ecological wars.
Pitter patter?
Yeah.
Discourse?
And I because I'm nervous about that, even as you say,
Me
this
too.
is the romanticization, and yet is it still a romanticization of a particular icon of a different and better relation to the non-human world? And so how do you negotiate that kind of dilemma?
Several things to say about that. The anxiety I feel in doing this is very live. For several reasons. Not least, I didn't earn my credentials in long-term, at-risk, living, needing to, address Navajo or other interlocutors. This is ripped off of other people's writing. Very cheap. Okay. No, I'm serious. The level of risk is very different. Okay. Then there is the question of what in the world, why in the world would I respond to that question by refusing to know? Why in the world would I respond to that question by walking away from taking the contemporary struggles on Big Mountain seriously? Why in the world would I answer that question by not noticing the unclosed nature of the cat's cradling going on, including the overwhelmingly white Navajo Churro Sheep Association, which is in alliance and disalliance with some of the Churro Sheep worlds. It seems, again, I'm drawn like a moth to the flame to stuff that makes me really anxious. And this is one of them. Besides, I spent my girlhood fantasizing about being kidnapped by Indians on horseback. I've been talking about what you can't not write about. I was sure it was going to be better than Irish Catholic Denver.
Donna, thank you. As somebody who unwillingly, non-optionally contributes to the relentless boredom of Heidegger's text.
That was a very bad joke.
I really appreciated your attempt to bring in Heidegger's notion of world in a multi-species idea of sensibility. I think that I guess what I'm trying to think about is how world and earth appear and what your Heideggerian relation between world and earth. And these are the reasons I'm trying to make this as clear as possible. World belongs to the notion of Heideggerian practicity, that human finitude not only is aware of itself, but testifies to itself. And art is one of these ways. And so I think it's striking that the figures you present us are artistic figures.
And machines, pigeons, and people all as testifiers.
Right. So I guess, so what I'm trying to I'm trying to get towards is the distinction between the kind of human Dasein that's engaged in worlding versus non-human animal Dasein that testifies to its finitude without a human witness necessarily. In other words, is storytelling part of, Jean-Luc calls his reading of human finitude as engaging in these inscriptions, such as art. That's why there are many arts rather than just one, as Nancy says in the Muses. Is the worlding you're talking about, what are the limits of what are the limits of that worlding and that storytelling? I guess I'm asking, has to do with the presence of animals that we humans just don't think about as part of the world, or are animals engaged, non-human animals engaged in a kind of worlding and a facticity, a practice of facticity? I'm not talking about cats painting or
No. No, and selling their art for high prices. No, I didn't even imagine you were talking about that. So you can't buy them on the internet. No,
I'm just wondering if do non-human animals belong to Earth, or do they belong to
in the
world?
Yeah, well, two things. I feel like the Navajo string figure of coyote running in two directions on that one. Worlding has many sources, only one of which is out of the Heideggerian or existentialist phenomenological set of relays. That's an important set of relays in my heritage because I loved Heidegger as a college student, and they're just an important set of reference points. But the fundamental reference points for me are really feminist science fiction worlding, and the worlding practices out of the highly imperialist genre of science fiction, which is not ever and never was nothing but. I am really interested in the question of plausible worlds and worlding in the various filmic and literary and other practices, as Shah Labar, years ago, was Fred Jameson's student, and then it came to the history of consciousness. He talks about the scientific mode and just a theory of history. Anyway, worlding for me actually only secondarily is in the Heideggerian tone. That's one point. Second, then the next point is I put my tail between my legs and against my belly and run to Derrida and go to the non-pouvoir, the shared relentless co-vulnerability. But what I don't do with Derrida and can't get away with, but it's again that both and need. I know where to stop, but I can't stop there. I know to stop with Derrida when he walks away from his cat that morning in that bathroom, or lets the cat out the door. I know that that's really as far as he could go, but I'm too much of a biologist or a biobehavioral evolutionary whatever, or a dog person or something, or a cat person, critter person, including mushrooms and ferns. And I long thought that if psychoanalysis were developed with the reproductive and sexual goings on of yeast, we would have been really much more richly endowed theoretically. Anyway, that's another annoyance. But I want not just the patience, the passion, the non-pouvoir, the utter, granted that this is caught in the paradigm of recognition, but forgive him that for the moment, the understanding of being in the presence of somebody, not something, and that you cannot make it a furry, a human being in a fur coat. He's really, really good at that. But what he was so good at it that it became almost impossible to ask the cat anything. And I don't mean in some sort of voice. It became almost impossible to engage in a knowledge project with the cat, where curiosity is enacted in an entangled way that I think